Vienna, June 1938. An 82-year-old man crosses the Austrian border carrying a passport stamped with a red J. He is not just any man. He is the man who had convinced the 20th century that its dreams carried hidden meaning, that its forgettings were never accidental, that love for the mother and fear of the father shaped every decision without anyone ever knowing it. He had been living with jaw cancer for 16 years. He had refused to leave Vienna, even as the Nazis marched through the streets of the city where he had spent 78 years of his life. He only left when the Gestapo took his daughter in for questioning. On the train to Paris, someone asked him what he thought of the Nazis. He answered with a single sentence: "The progress of civilization is nothing more than a belt stretched over a volcano." The man's name was Sigmund Freud, and the volcano was what lived inside each and every one of us. For decades, most people reduced Freud to a punchline. The couch doctor. The man who saw hidden urges in everything. But that caricature serves a very convenient purpose. It keeps us from taking too seriously what he actually discovered about the human mind. Because if we do, some of our most comfortable certainties begin to crack. This is not the story of the comfortable myth. It is the story of the man who spent his life trying to understand why human beings run from themselves. There is a word that has made its way into every European language, born from the name of a single theory. Freudian, used to describe a telling slip of the tongue, a dream laced with hidden meaning, an inexplicable attraction that conceals something else entirely. Used, more often than not, by people who have never read a single line of Freud, and who associate his name with a watered-down version of a theory he himself revised, complicated, and sometimes flatly contradicted over 40 years of work. It is one of the greatest misunderstandings in the intellectual history of the 20th century. Sigmund Freud was born in 1856 in Moravia, the son of a Jewish wool merchant who moved the family to Vienna when Sigmund was 4 years old. He grew up in a city that was simultaneously the capital of one of Europe's most sophisticated empires, and a place where anti-Semitism quietly shaped the boundaries of what a person could hope to achieve. He came to medicine by a process of elimination. He specialized in neurology, and by his 30s, he had built a respectable career, though one that fell well short of the greatness he so clearly craved. What followed was one of the most radical intellectual transformations in the history of medicine. Freud did not invent the idea of the unconscious. What he invented was a method for accessing it, a theory about how it shaped human behavior, and a clinical practice that aimed to use that access to relieve suffering. He called it psychoanalysis. Throughout this piece, you will come to understand what that word truly means, and why it still makes people uncomfortable. But before stepping into his life, I need to leave you with a question that textbooks rarely ask outright. Freud built psychoanalysis on real clinical cases. Decades after his death, historians who gained access to his archives discovered that some of those cases had been presented selectively, that results which failed to confirm his theories had been left out, that patients described as cured were not, in fact, cured. Freud knew this. So what does it mean to know that the founder of a theory designed to expose the mechanisms of self-deception was himself a remarkably sophisticated practitioner of the very self-deception he described? Imagine growing up in Vienna in the mid-19th century. Not the Vienna of palaces and opera houses that the history books describe. That Vienna exists, but it exists for others. Your Vienna is an overcrowded apartment in the second district, the Leopoldstadt, the Jewish quarter, where families are packed into small rooms, and where the smell of cooking food and laundered clothes soaks into the wooden staircases that creak under every step. Your father's name is Jacob. He is 40 years older than your mother and has grown children from a previous marriage who are rarely mentioned. He is a wool merchant, not a wealthy man, not a powerful man, but a good-natured man of considerable intelligence who never found in life the circumstances his talent deserved. There is a resignation in him that his eldest son watches with an attention he cannot yet name, but will never forget. Your mother's name is Amelie. She is 20 years younger than her husband, and her energy fills every room she walks into. She holds an unwavering conviction about her eldest son that she hides from no one, that Sigmund is special, that Sigmund will go far, that Sigmund has a destiny that the apartment in the Leopoldstadt cannot contain. This conviction had practical consequences. When young Sigmund needed to study and his younger siblings were playing piano in the next room, the piano was sold. When money was tight and there wasn't enough for books, Sigmund's books were bought first. When there was a room with better light, it was Sigmund's room. The family had come to Vienna from Freiburg in Moravia. When Sigmund was 4 years old, a move forced by the financial difficulties of his father's business and the growing instability facing Jewish communities in Moravia. Freud carried with him from his Freiburg childhood only scattered but intensely vivid memories, green fields, clean air, a physical freedom that Vienna never replicated. The move to the city was a loss that stayed with him. Vienna compensated with other things. School, the gymnasium, where Sigmund consistently ranked first in his class for every year he was there, with an ease that his teachers recognized as exceptional and that his classmates recognized with the mix of admiration and resentment that always trails talent that is too obvious. He learned Latin, Greek, French, and English, and then on his own picked up Spanish and Italian. He read at a speed and with a retention that unnerved those who watched him. And he wrote, from an early age, with a clarity and a rhythm that were uncommon in an adolescent, and that would be recognized decades later as one of the most remarkable literary qualities in the scientific prose of the 20th century. But there was something in Vienna that no amount of talent could erase. Anti-Semitism was not the open violence of the pogroms sweeping the Jews of Eastern Europe. It was subtler, and therefore more constant, the exclusion from certain academic positions, the invisible ceiling on university careers, the comments that weren't direct insults, but that regularly reminded Jewish people that there was a line between those who fully belonged to Vienna and those who belonged only conditionally. Freud encountered this line early, and he encountered it repeatedly. In an autobiography, he described the moment his father told him that, as a young man, a Christian had knocked his hat off his head in the street and shouted at him to get to the sidewalk where he belonged. Freud asked his father what he had done. His father said he had picked up the hat. The answer disturbed the son deeply. Not the humiliation itself, but the acceptance of humiliation as something that required no response. Freud spent the rest of his life refusing to accept humiliation without a response. This refusal came at a cost. It made him combative in an academic culture that prized hierarchical deference. It made him incapable of backing down in disputes, where backing down would have been the wiser move. It made him, at times, the architect of his own difficulties. But it also made him incapable of stopping when the obstacles seemed insurmountable. In 1873, at the age of 17, Sigmund Freud enrolled in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Vienna, not out of calling, out of calculation. The options available to a brilliant young Jewish man in Vienna in 1873 were law, medicine, or commerce. Law served a state that excluded him. Commerce was what his father had tried and failed at. Medicine offered independence, intellectual prestige, and the possibility of scientific research, which was what he actually wanted. He entered the university intending to become a scientist. He left 8 years later with a medical degree and the conviction that what he had studied was only the beginning of what he needed to learn. There is a paradox at the heart of Freud's early career that his biographers rarely examine with the attention it deserves. The man who would come to be known as the explorer of the unconscious, that most subjective and inaccessible territory of human experience, spent the first 12 years of his professional life trying to reduce the mind to matter, trying to prove that everything that happened in the human psyche could be explained in terms of neurons, synapses, and electrochemical processes that could be observed, measured, and described with the precision of physics. This wasn't naivety. It was the dominant scientific program of his era. Ernst Bruck's laboratory, where Freud worked for 6 years after entering the university, was one of the most rigorous centers of European physiology. Bruck was a man of absolute scientific conviction. There was nothing in the mind that was not matter in motion. No vital force, no soul, no non-physical principle that explained human behavior. What existed were nerve cells, connections between them, and processes that science did not yet fully understand, but would come to understand progressively, as instruments and methods improved. Freud absorbed this program so completely that it shaped everything he would build later, even when what he built later appeared to have abandoned it entirely. The laboratory work was meticulous, and it was fascinating to someone with the patience to operate at that scale. Freud had that patience. He spent years dissecting the nervous systems of eels and lampreys, creatures whose primitive neurological anatomy made visible structures that in higher vertebrates were too complex to isolate. He published papers on the histology of nerve cells that specialists recognized as solid contributions. He developed a technique for staining nervous tissue that made previously invisible structures visible. He worked with the concentration of someone who had found the place he was meant to be, and then the money ran out. Not metaphorically, literally. Research grants in Vienna were scarce and fiercely competitive, and Freud had come too late to the realization that a career in pure academic research required not just talent, but family connections and financial resources he didn't have. Bruck, who genuinely admired him, called him into his office one day and told him, with the directness of someone who respects their listener too much to lie, that there was no place for him in academic research, that he should go into clinical practice, that he should earn a living. There was also Martha. Martha Bernays was the daughter of a Jewish family from Hamburg, intelligent, composed, with an emotional steadiness that contrasted with Freud's intensity in a way he recognized as complementary. They got engaged in 1882 after a courtship of just a few months. Martha was in Hamburg. Freud was in Vienna without enough money to marry. The engagement lasted for years. The letters Freud wrote to Martha during those 4 years, more than 900 of them, some running 20 pages long, are extraordinary documents of love, ambition, impatience, and a self-awareness that oscillated between absolute lucidity and selective blindness. Freud knew exactly what he wanted. He knew exactly what he lacked to get it. And he wrote about both with an honesty that made the letters literature entirely apart from the theory that had yet to be built. To earn enough money to get married, Freud went to work at Vienna General Hospital and then opened a private practice. It was also during this period that the cocaine episode happened. In 1884, Freud read a report on cocaine experiments conducted by American military physicians who had discovered that the substance reduced fatigue and increased endurance. He immediately recognized the potential, both scientific and personal. He ordered a supply, tested it on himself, and was sufficiently impressed with the effects to write an enthusiastic paper on its therapeutic properties. The paper recommended cocaine for treating pain, depression, and morphine addiction. It was wrong about almost everything. But there was a detail in this story that Freud never forgot, and that biographers identify as formative. A colleague named Karl Koller, to whom Freud had mentioned his experiments, investigated cocaine's anesthetic properties on the cornea, and made the discovery that would transform ophthalmology, that cocaine was an effective local anesthetic for eye surgery. The discovery was presented at a conference in September 1884, and it made Koller immediately famous. Freud was not at the conference. He had gone to Hamburg to visit Martha. The decision to go see his fiancée instead of continuing his research cost him one of the most important medical discoveries of the 19th century. Freud wrote about this episode with a restraint that suggests the emotional cost was considerable, and that the lesson about what happens when sentiment overrides work was engraved in him with a permanence that shaped how he handled personal relationships for the rest of his life. The wedding took place in September 1886. Martha and Sigmund had 6 children in 8 years. The domestic life that followed was comfortable and, by all available accounts, affectionate. It was also completely separate from his work. Freud did not discuss cases with Martha, did not share the ideas he was developing, kept his professional life in a compartment that domestic life never penetrated. This separation was not coldness. It was the product of a conviction that Freud never stated directly, but that his work reveals consistently that work was the place where he was fully himself, and that everything else, however much it mattered, was circumstance. The work, in 1885, was about to shift direction in a way that none of the years before it had fully prepared him for. Freud had won a fellowship to study in Paris, and Paris had shocked. The Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris was not a place that invited hope. It was one of the largest hospital complexes in Europe, a city within a city, with churches, gardens, workshops, and wards that housed more than 4,000 patients, most of them women, most of them poor, most of them with no realistic prospect of leaving. It had been built in the 17th century as a dumping ground for Paris's unwanted beggars, prostitutes, epileptics, women deemed mad, for reasons that the records of the era rarely specified with any precision. By the 19th century, it had become a leading European psychiatric hospital. But the architecture of exclusion remained in the grey stone of the buildings and the smell of damp and disinfectant that soaked the hallways. Jean-Martin Charcot had worked there for 30 years, and he had transformed the Salpêtrière into the world center for the study of a condition that medicine could neither explain nor ignore. Hysteria. The name came from the Greek word for uterus, the ancient theory being that the condition was caused by a female organ that wandered through the body, producing symptoms wherever it landed. This theory had been formally abandoned, but the name remained, and with it remained a diagnostic ambiguity that made hysteria simultaneously the most common and least understood condition in European psychiatry. Hysterical patients presented with limb paralysis that had no detectable neurological cause, with blindness that showed no ocular pathology, with convulsions that neurologists could distinguish from epilepsy by their patterns, but could not explain, with personality shifts, amnesias, and trance states that appeared and disappeared without any identifiable physical correlate. The dominant interpretation was that they were faking it. Charcot disagreed. What Charcot had discovered, and what he demonstrated in his famous Leçons du Mardi, the Tuesday lectures open to the public, that drew physicians, students, writers, and curious onlookers from across Europe, was that hysterical symptoms could be both produced and eliminated through hypnosis. A patient with right arm paralysis could, under hypnosis, move the arm normally. The same patient could, under hypnosis, develop left arm paralysis that had not existed before. This proved two things. First, that the symptoms were not faked. No actor could control with that precision what they manifested and what they did not, while under hypnosis. Second, that the symptoms originated in the mind, not the body. They were produced by psychological processes that operated outside the patient's conscious control. Freud arrived in Paris in October 1885 with a 5-month fellowship and expectations that the documents of the period describe as considerable. What he found exceeded those expectations. Not because of the scientific rigor of Charcot, whom Freud recognized as an extraordinary clinical observer but a limited theorist, but because of the scale of the problem Charcot had identified, and the implication that Freud immediately grasped and that Charcot never fully developed. If hysterical symptoms were produced by unconscious psychological processes that operated outside consciousness and that could be accessed through hypnosis, then there was a part of the mind that functioned independently of consciousness, and was powerful enough to paralyze limbs, eliminate vision, and produce convulsions. This was not a minor observation. It was proof that the unconscious was not a philosophical abstraction but a clinical reality with measurable physical consequences. Freud wrote to Martha about Charcot with an admiration that the letters show as genuine and growing, describing the hypnosis demonstrations with the excitement of someone who is seeing for the first time a window that he didn't know existed, one that opens onto a landscape that changes everything he thought he knew about the human mind. He returned to Vienna in February 1886, transformed, not in the dramatic sense of a sudden conversion, but in the deeper sense of someone who had seen something that made it impossible to continue working the same way. Ruckest program, reducing the mind to observable physical processes, had been the intellectual framework for the first 12 years. Paris had shown him that there were mental processes producing real physical effects that were simply not accessible by the methods of physiology. They needed another method. Freud still didn't know what that method was. He presented Charcot's ideas at a conference in Vienna in October 1886. The reception was cold. The Viennese neurologists considered male hysteria, which Charcot had described and which Freud had mentioned, a clinical impossibility. Hysteria was by etymological definition and medical consensus a female condition. A prominent physician asked Freud, with the courtesy of someone who considers the answer obvious, where exactly he had seen cases of male hysteria in Vienna. Freud said he could show them. He asked the hospital where he worked for access to suitable patients for a demonstration. The request was denied. The denial was not merely bureaucratic. It was a signal that he had arrived with ideas that challenged the established consensus. And the established consensus was not interested in being challenged by a young physician without sufficient reputation to make demands. Freud opened a private practice. He began seeing patients with symptoms that conventional neurology could not explain. And he began searching for the method he still didn't have, a way to access the unconscious he had witnessed in Paris, without the theatrical staging of Charcot's public demonstrations, and with a precision that would allow him not just to observe the processes but to understand and ultimately change them. The answer would come through an older colleague who had been quietly working on the same problem for years. The colleague's name was Joseph Breuer, and he had a patient he had never spoken about publicly. Today, when someone walks into a therapist's office and begins talking about their childhood, about their parents, about the dream they had last week, and the relationship they can't seem to leave, even though they know they should, they are doing something that in 1880 did not exist as a structured clinical practice. The idea that talking about suffering can relieve suffering seems so obvious today that it's hard to recover just how radical it once was. Joseph Breuer had stumbled upon this idea by accident. Breuer was the most respected physician in Vienna, not an academic, not a theorist, but a clinician of a competence and humanity that his patients recognized and his colleagues admired. He was also Freud's mentor and friend, to whom Freud owed considerable financial favors during his lean years, and whom he respected with an intensity that would make the later rupture all the more painful. Between 1880 and 1882, Breuer had treated a patient who would be described years later in studies on hysteria under the pseudonym Anna O. Her real name was Bertha Pappenheim. She was 21 years old when the treatment began. The daughter of a wealthy Jewish family in Vienna. She was intelligent, she spoke 4 languages, read voraciously, possessed an intellectual capacity that the domestic environment of the era had no way of putting to use. Her father fell gravely ill, and Bertha dedicated herself to his care with an intensity that contemporary observers described as excessive, and that modern criteria would recognize as the progressive collapse of a person who had no other outlet for her energy. When her father died, the symptoms exploded in full constellation: paralysis of the right arm, severe vision disturbances, a nervous cough, difficulty swallowing, personality shifts. There were moments when Bertha seemed to be an entirely different person, with distinct memories, behaviors, and even a different accent. Amnesias, trance states that could last for hours. Breuer visited her daily. What he discovered was that when he could induce a light hypnotic state and encourage Bertha to speak freely about her thoughts and fantasies, she would sometimes spontaneously arrive at memories associated with the onset of specific symptoms, and that, after verbalizing those memories with the corresponding emotion, the symptoms would ease. Not permanently, not completely, but consistently enough to be recognizable as a pattern. Bertha herself gave the process a name. She called it the talking cure. She also called it, with an irony that the documents preserve, chimney sweeping. Breuer was fascinated, and he was troubled. The trouble had a specific reason that the public versions of the case rarely stated with full clarity. Bertha had developed an attachment to her physician that exceeded the therapeutic relationship in ways that Breuer recognized as clinically significant and personally uncomfortable. There were sessions in which the emotional transfer was so intense that Breuer would arrive home shaken. His wife had noticed. Breuer had decided to end the treatment. On the day he told Bertha the treatment was ending, she went into crisis, a crisis that included, according to Breuer's account to Freud, the conviction that she was pregnant with the doctor's child. Breuer left Bertha's house that night and took his wife on a trip to Venice. He never spoke publicly about the case again until Freud persuaded him, years later, to collaborate on studies on hysteria. Freud heard Breuer's story with the attention of someone who immediately recognizes that what he is hearing matters. Not just the clinical case, but Breuer's disturbance, the intensity of Bertha's attachment, the way in which the therapeutic relationship had produced phenomena that didn't fit the available models. There was something here that Charcot's hypnosis hadn't captured. Charcot's hypnosis was spectacle, a public demonstration of the power of the unconscious that required nothing from the physician except technique. What had happened between Breuer and Bertha was something else, a relationship in which the emotional intensity was itself the therapeutic instrument, in which what healed wasn't the hypnotic trance, but the act of verbalizing what had never been verbalized, in the presence of someone who was truly listening. Freud spent years fully understanding what this meant. The collaboration with Breuer produced studies on hysteria. Published in 1895, the first psychoanalytic text, which presented 5 clinical cases and proposed that hysterical symptoms were traumatic, memories that had not been processed consciously and that remained active in the unconscious, producing symptoms. The book sold poorly and was received with indifference by most of the medical community. But it contained, in the subtext of its clinical cases and in the theoretical disagreements between the two authors that any attentive reader could detect, the map of the territory that Freud would spend the next 40 years exploring. The break with Breuer was gradual, and it was painful. Breuer grew uncomfortable with the increasingly sexual direction. Freud was taking the theory, the insistence, that behind every hysterical symptom lay a trauma of a sexual nature, that sexuality was the fundamental engine of the unconscious processes producing suffering. Breuer thought it was too much, that there were other factors, that the generalization was excessive. Freud thought Breuer didn't have the courage to follow the evidence wherever it led. They parted with the cold courtesy of two men who had shared something important and chose not to speak about what had failed. Freud continued alone, and he began doing to the only patient available to him at any hour of the day what he had learned to do with others. He began to analyze himself. In this book, I have attempted to interpret dreams, and in doing so, I hope to have shown that there exists a psychological technique which makes it possible to interpret dreams, and that on the application of this method every dream reveals itself as a meaningful psychical structure. Freud wrote that sentence in the introduction to The Interpretation of Dreams in 1899. Read today. It sounds like the opening statement of a science book, technical, precise, modest in its phrasing, if not in its scope. What it doesn't convey is the context in which it was written. By a 43-year-old man who had spent the previous 3 years systematically analyzing his own dreams in an intellectual solitude that the documents of the period describe as suffocating. The starting point was his father's death. Jacob Freud died in October 1896 at the age of 81, after a period of progressive decline that his son had watched, with a mix of care and impatience that he recognized as ambivalent but could not simplify. The death produced in Freud a reaction that surprised him with its intensity. It wasn't the expected grief. It was a deeper and more diffuse disturbance, vivid dreams that woke him in the middle of the night, chains of associations that led to places he hadn't expected, an agitation that daily work didn't relieve and that self-examination was beginning to reveal as having roots far older and more complex than the immediate loss of his father. Freud had a theory about what was happening. He had proposed in previous years that neurotic symptoms were repressed traumatic memories that the unconscious kept active without allowing them access to consciousness. If this was true for his patients, it must be true for himself. And if it was true for himself, then dreams which Charcot had ignored and Breuer had mentioned without developing might be the most direct path to what the unconscious was keeping hidden. He began recording his dreams. Every morning, before getting out of bed, He wrote down everything he could remember. Then he applied to the dream account the method he had developed with his patients, free association. The instruction to say everything that came to mind without censorship, without selection, without the critical filter that consciousness normally imposed on thought. What emerged from these sessions of self-analysis was material that Freud described in letters to his friend Wilhelm Fleises, with a mix of excitement and unease that the letters convey with a vividness that no later description quite matches. In the dreams were desires he shouldn't have had, hostilities toward people he loved, attractions that his daytime consciousness suppressed with an efficiency that his nighttime dreams completely ignored. And there, again and again, were his parents. His mother, young and beautiful in the dream images in a way she had actually been when Freud was 3 or 4 years old, and that conscious memory hadn't preserved, but that the dream recovered with a disturbing clarity. His father, present in ways that oscillated between admiration and rivalry, between respect and an aggression that death had made impossible to express directly and that the dreams kept processing. Freud recognized in these patterns something that the texts on hysteria had not yet named directly. He called it the Oedipus complex, the idea that the child develops a sexual attraction toward the parent of the opposite sex and a rivalry with the parent of the same sex, and that the resolution of this tension fundamentally structures the adult psyche, was first identified by Freud in himself before he proposed it as universal. This sequence, observe in oneself, generalize to everyone, is the method of psychoanalysis, and it is also its most vulnerable point. A theory built from a self-analysis and a limited number of clinical cases does not have the empirical foundation that 20th century science would come to require. Freud knew this. He did not say so publicly with that kind of clarity. What he said publicly was in The Interpretation of Dreams, the book he wrote between 1897 and 1899 and which he considered the most important work of his life. The book's structure was simultaneously scientific and literary, clinical cases, alternating with analyses of the author's own dreams, abstract theory woven together with narratives that had the quality of the finest short fiction of the era. Freud had learned through years of clinical practice that ideas reach people through stories, not through arguments, and he wrote the book with an awareness of this truth that made every chapter both a demonstration and an explanation. The central argument was radical in its simplicity. Dreams were not random noise produced by a sleeping brain. They were messages from the unconscious to the conscious, encoded in images and narratives that followed specific mechanisms and could be deciphered with the right method. Behind every dream was a wish, often a wish that daytime consciousness suppressed, that the dream fulfilled in a disguised form, disguised just enough to keep the dreamer from waking. The book was published in November 1899, with the date 1900 on the cover, because Freud wanted it to be the book of the new century. It sold 350 copies in the first 6 years. The reviews it received were scarce and mostly negative. Freud wrote to Fleises that the book had been received as though it didn't exist. But he kept going. Because he had learned from his father's resignation, from the hat his father had picked up off the ground without a word, that there were 2 ways to respond to humiliation, and he had chosen the other one. There is a paradox at the heart of Freud's intellectual maturity that his admirers rarely discuss and that his critics rarely analyze with the depth it deserves. The man who had described with unprecedented precision the mechanisms by which human beings avoid seeing what they don't want to see, repression, denial, rationalization, projection, built around his theory, a movement that used those very same mechanisms to protect itself from external criticism and internal dissent. It was not simple hypocrisy. It was something more complex and more interesting, an involuntary demonstration that the mechanisms he had described were powerful enough to operate, even in the person who had identified and named them. The decade following the publication of The Interpretation of Dreams was the decade in which psychoanalysis ceased to be the solitary theory of a Viennese physician and became an international movement with associations, conferences, a scientific journal, and a body of followers that Freud recruited, trained, and, when necessary, expelled with an energy that contemporary observers described with growing discomfort. The original nucleus was the Wednesday meetings. Starting in 1902, a group of physicians and intellectuals gathered weekly in the waiting room of Freud's consulting office at Burgos, 19, with its couches and Egyptian antiquities arranged with a precision that photographs made iconic, to discuss cases, present papers, and develop the theory. The meetings had a quality that participants described in ways that vary significantly depending on their later relationship with Freud. Those who remained loyal described the atmosphere as one of extraordinary intellectual freedom, a space where the most radical ideas could be explored without the constraints of established academic consensus. Those who later broke away described something different, an undeclared hierarchy in which Freud's ideas occupied the center, and others' ideas were welcome insofar as they developed and confirmed the center without challenging its foundations. Both descriptions are probably true at different moments. The group grew. Alfred Adler arrived, a Viennese physician with his own ideas about power and inferiority as fundamental motivators of behavior. Otto Rank arrived, a young man without medical training whom Freud adopted as his secretary and intellectual son. Others came: physicians, psychiatrists, writers, intellectuals who recognized in psychoanalysis a key to territories that established disciplines couldn't open. And Carl Gustav Jung arrived. Jung was different from everyone else. He was Swiss, not Austrian. He was Christian, not Jewish, something that mattered to Freud in ways the letters reveal with a clarity that Freud never expressed publicly. He was a psychiatrist at one of Europe's most important hospitals, the Berg Holzli in Zurich, with an established academic reputation that none of the Viennese members of the group possessed. And in the early years of their relationship, he was exactly what Freud needed. Psychoanalysis risked being seen as a Viennese Jewish theory, geographically and culturally circumscribed, easily dismissed as the product of a specific community with specific concerns. Jung gave the movement a geographic, cultural, and academic legitimacy that expanded it beyond those borders. Freud acknowledged this explicitly in the letters, and acknowledged something more personal as well. He saw in Jung the intellectual son he had been searching for, the heir who would carry the work forward after him. He wrote letters to Jung of an intimacy that letters to other colleagues never approached, shared doubts he rarely shared, and invested in the relationship an emotional intensity that would make the later rupture as devastating as it was inevitable. In 1910, the International Psychoanalytic Association was founded at the Nuremberg Congress, with Jung as president. Freud had built the movement he wanted, and he had also built, without realizing it, the conditions for the ruptures that would define it. Because the movement had a structural contradiction that no personal loyalty could resolve indefinitely. It was a movement founded on the idea that knowledge advances through honest investigation of phenomena, including phenomena that contradict established theories. But it was governed by a founder who distinguished between the legitimate development of the theory which was welcome, and the questioning of its foundations, which was treated as betrayal. This distinction was never declared as a rule. It was communicated through reactions, through the enthusiasm with which Freud responded to certain ideas, and the silence with which he met others, through the way in which dissent was treated not as theoretical disagreement, but as a problem of personal loyalty. Members of the group learned to read these signals. Most adapted. Those who didn't, Adler, then Jung, then others, were progressively marginalized until the break became the only exit available. Adler was the first. He had developed a theory proposing that the central motivation of human behavior was not the sexual libido but the drive to overcome a fundamental sense of inferiority, the will to power in the individual, psychological sense of the term. It was a theory that, by contradicting the primacy of sexuality, touched a foundation that Freud was not willing to cede. The Wednesday meetings grew progressively more tense. Adler's papers were discussed with a hostility that exceeded theoretical disagreements. In 1911, Adler and a group of his followers left the Vienna group. Freud wrote to Jung that the movement's purity had been preserved. Jung responded with the enthusiasm Freud expected. 2 years later, it would be Jung's turn. In September 1909, Freud and Jung traveled together to the United States. It was the only time Freud ever set foot on American soil, invited for a series of lectures at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts, that represented the first formal academic recognition of psychoanalysis outside Europe. The trip lasted several weeks. The two men shared cabins on the ship, visited Niagara Falls together, and analyzed each other's dreams during the voyage. It was during this trip that the rupture began, not as confrontation, but as a growing discomfort that neither man named directly for years. Jung later described a specific moment on the ship. Freud had asked Jung to share a dream for analysis. Jung shared it. Freud began analyzing and reached a point where he needed more personal information to continue. Jung hesitated. The information was of an intimacy he wasn't ready to reveal. Freud said he preferred not to risk losing his authority by revealing his own personal life. Jung held on to that sentence. He never forgot it, because the sentence revealed, with a clarity that the context made impossible to ignore, that for Freud there was a hierarchy between authority and honesty, and that when the two came into conflict, authority won. For a man who had built the most anti-authoritarian theory in the history of psychology, it was a contradiction that Jung could not resolve. The theoretical disagreement that unfolded in the following years had this personal tension as its substrate. Jung had been working with psychotic patients at the Berg-Halsey, a population that the original Freudian theory didn't adequately describe. The neuroses that Freud had studied in Vienna were conditions of functioning people whose suffering was rooted in the tension between desire and repression. Psychosis was something else, a more fundamental collapse of the relationship with reality that the sexual theory couldn't fully explain. Jung proposed that there was a collective unconscious, a stratum of the psyche that was not individual but shared by the species, composed of archetypes that recurred repeatedly in the dreams, myths, and religions of cultures with no contact with each other. It was an idea that expanded the Freudian unconscious in a way Freud considered a regression into mysticism. The letters exchanged between 1911 and 1913 are extraordinary documents. In them, genuine intellectual love progressively transforms into hostility without ever quite ceasing to be love. There are misunderstandings that both men recognized as misunderstandings, but that neither was willing to undo, because undoing them would have required concessions that the theory didn't allow. There are moments of cruelty from both sides that biographers identify as revealing not just the personal rupture, but the limitations of two men who had built systems of thought comprehensive enough to explain others, yet not honest enough to fully explain themselves. In January 1913, Jung resigned as president of the International Psychoanalytic Association. Freud wrote to a friend that the danger had passed. What had passed was the most important intellectual relationship of his adult life, and it would take Freud years to acknowledge, even partially, what the loss had cost him. The ruptures continued. Otto Rank, the intellectual adopted son, who had been closer to Freud than any other member of the movement, proposed in 1924 that the fundamental trauma was not the Oedipus complex, but the birth trauma, the abrupt separation from the womb, as the model for all subsequent anxiety. Freud responded with a coldness that Rank hadn't expected. The idea was not incompatible with Freudian theory, it was a development that could have been integrated. But in Rank's proposal there was an independence that Freud interpreted, correctly or not, as the beginning of a distancing that the history of the others had made recognizable as a pattern. The relationship deteriorated. Rank emigrated to the United States. The correspondence ceased. Freud wrote about Rank with a bitterness that the texts of the period show as disproportionate to the theoretical disagreement, suggesting that what he was processing was not just the loss of a collaborator, but the repetition of a pattern he could not prevent and could not fully understand. The pattern was this: Freud needed followers intelligent enough to develop the theory, but deferential enough not to challenge its foundations. Followers intelligent enough to develop the theory tended to develop their own ideas that eventually conflicted with those foundations. And when they did, Freud interpreted the conflict not as intellectual debate, but as personal betrayal. World War I cut through this period with a brutality that put to the theory a question that the Viennese neuroses had never posed. The soldiers returning from the trenches with symptoms, paralysis, muteness, tremors, recurring nightmares that jolted them awake in panic, had no stories of childhood sexual trauma to explain their collapse. They had stories of industrial-scale violence that no theory of libido could directly accommodate. Freud responded with a revision of the theory of the drives. He introduced the death drive, thanatos, alongside the life drive, eros. The idea was radical and met with resistance, even within the movement. The notion that in the human psyche there was an impulse toward destruction, aggression, a return to the inorganic state that was as fundamental and irreducible as the impulse toward pleasure and life. Critics thought it was pessimism dressed up as theory. Freud thought it was honesty about what the war had proven. He was right and wrong for the wrong reasons at the same time, as he often was. In 1923, Freud was diagnosed with jaw cancer. The physician who diagnosed him did not immediately tell him the truth. When Freud finally learned what he had, he asked the doctor a question the doctor hadn't expected. He didn't ask how long he had. He asked whether he could continue working. Over the following 16 years, he would undergo 33 surgeries. He wore a painful prosthetic that made speaking difficult and eating nearly impossible. He continued seeing patients. He continued writing. He continued smoking. The man who had spent his life describing the mechanisms of self-destruction could not stop his own. What does that mean for the theory? Today, when a patient receives a cancer diagnosis, there are protocols, second opinions, multidisciplinary teams, structured conversations about prognosis and quality of life that try to balance clinical honesty with emotional care. In April 1923, Felix Deutsch examined Freud's jaw and immediately recognized what he was looking at. He didn't tell his patient what it was. He said there was a lesion that needed to be removed. He arranged a surgery. He waited for others to tell Freud what he couldn't bring himself to say. The reason Deutsch gave later for his silence was concern about the psychological impact. Freud had recently mentioned the name of a friend who had chosen suicide after a serious diagnosis, and Deutsch feared that immediate honesty would produce the same outcome. The real reason was probably simpler. Telling Sigmund Freud that he had cancer was one of the most difficult conversations any physician could imagine having. When Freud finally learned the full picture, oral cancer, almost certainly caused by tobacco, in a location that made repeated surgical treatment unavoidable, the question he asked was not about death. It was about work. This question, which biographers cite as revealing of his character, had multiple layers. There was the genuine determination of a man who had defined his identity by his work for 40 years, for whom the impossibility of working would be a loss of self more profound than the prospect of death. There was also the practical calculation of someone who knew that the psychoanalytic movement was at a critical stage of expansion, and that his active presence was still needed to guide the direction he intended. And there was, perhaps, something that Freudian theory would name without difficulty, but that Freud himself never articulated directly: the refusal to confront what confronting would mean, the defense mechanism operating precisely where it always operates with the greatest efficiency, at the point of greatest threat. The first surgery removed part of his jaw and palate. Freud woke from the anesthesia in a shared room with a dwarf, the only space available in the hospital. He was alone. The hemorrhage that followed was severe enough to require emergency intervention. His youngest son, who had come to the hospital to be with him, had stepped out to eat something and was not there when the crisis occurred. Freud survived the first surgery. He would survive 32 more. The prosthetic he wore for the remaining 16 years of his life, a rubber and metal construction that replaced the removed palate and allowed some ability to speak and swallow, was extraordinarily uncomfortable. It had to be removed and reinserted to eat. It produced constant pain of varying intensity. It made speaking difficult to degrees that varied with fatigue and the condition of the wound. Freud continued seeing up to 8 patients a day. He continued writing with a productivity that the years before his diagnosis did not consistently surpass, and he continued smoking the cigars that physicians identified as the probable cause of his cancer, whose connection to the recurrences was clinically evident. Biographers treat this fact with a discomfort that is itself revealing. The founder of the theory that described the repetition compulsion, the mechanism by which human beings repeat destructive patterns precisely because they are destructive, in an unconscious attempt to master what they originally failed to master, was compulsively repeating the behavior that was destroying him. Freud knew the theory. He applied it to patients with a precision that the clinical texts extensively document. He did not apply it to himself with the same honesty. Or he applied it and concluded that the pleasure of the cigars was worth the cost, which would be a form of brutal honesty that no biography clearly documents, but that the facts make plausible. It was during this period, under the shadow of cancer and with Europe showing the first signs of what was to come, that Freud wrote the most pessimistic and most profound theoretical texts of his career. The Future of an Illusion in 1927 argued that religion was a collective illusion, not in the sense of being necessarily false, but in the psychoanalytic sense of being a belief motivated by desire rather than evidence. The belief in a divine protective father was the collective projection of the childhood desire for parental protection onto a cosmic scale. It was psychologically necessary for most people. It was epistemologically unsustainable for anyone who honestly followed the evidence. The book was controversial within the movement. Many analysts were religious, and the aggressiveness of Freud's critique of religion created tensions that diplomacy couldn't fully resolve. Freud did not soften his position. Civilization and its discontents in 1930 went further and went darker. The central argument was that civilization was built on the repression of the drives that life in society required sexual and aggressive impulses to be channeled, sublimated, controlled in ways that inevitably produced a suffering that no technical or social progress could eliminate. The more advanced the civilization, the greater the repression required. The greater the repression, the greater the accumulated discontent. It was an argument against Enlightenment optimism, against the idea that reason and progress converged toward a future of increasing happiness. And it was an argument that the following decade would make prophetic in ways that Freud did not live to fully witness, but that he had described with a precision that continues to unsettle. In 1930, he received the Goethe Prize for Literature. In 1933, the Nazis burned his books in Berlin. Freud remarked that it was progress compared to the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, they would have burned the author. He was not yet right about that, but it was getting closer. Vienna in March 1938 smelled like fear, not metaphorically. There was something different in the air of the streets of the First District, the Burgers, the Ringstrasse, the squares that Viennese residents crossed daily with the familiarity of people who know every stone, a quality that those who lived through those days described with a unanimity that transcends metaphor. It was the smell of the crowds gathering to watch the Nazis enter. It was the smell of the sudden acceleration of a process that had been building for years, and that in 48 hours went from abstract threat to concrete and irreversible reality. The Anschluss, the annexation of Austria by Nazi Germany, was completed on March 12, 1938. Freud was 82 years old, terminally ill with cancer, and he had not left Vienna. Not for lack of warnings. Friends had insisted for years. Colleagues who had already emigrated wrote letters that alternated between appeal and pleading. His daughter Anna, who had devoted her adult life to her father and to psychoanalysis with an intensity that biographers describe as simultaneously admirable and troubling, had said directly that they needed to leave. Freud's answer had been consistent. He was too old. He was too sick. The pain of the prosthetic made any long journey an ordeal that his body couldn't easily bear. And there was something more. Something that the letters of the period suggest, but that Freud never fully articulated. Vienna was his city, not in the sentimental sense of a romantic attachment to a place. In the deeper sense that the city and the work were inseparable, that Burgos, 19, with its consulting room, library, and Egyptian antiquities, arranged with a precision he himself had established over decades, was the environment without which the work didn't carry the same weight. To leave Vienna was to admit that Vienna had ceased to be what it had been. And admitting that was a loss that age and illness made difficult to bear. The Gestapo resolved the hesitation. On the morning of March 11th, GESTAPO agents appeared at Burgos 19 and took Anna Freud in for questioning at the organization's Vienna headquarters. Anna was returned that afternoon. She had not been physically harmed. She had not been formally charged with anything. She had been questioned for hours about the activities of the psychoanalytic movement, and then released with a courtesy that was itself a message. that the next time might be different, that the protection that had existed until that moment was not guaranteed, that a line had just been shown without being crossed. Freud spent that night in silence. The next day, he told Anna they were leaving. What followed was a negotiation that lasted 3 months and involved diplomatic interventions from several governments, substantial payments to the Nazi regime under various legal and illegal forms, and the signing of a document declaring that Freud had been treated with every respect by the German authorities and had no complaints to register. Freud signed the document. Then he added in the margin, in the small, precise handwriting that manuscripts show as characteristic of his final years, a sentence that those present described as delivered, with a dryness that made it impossible to tell whether it was humor or bitterness. I can recommend the Gestapo to everyone most highly. He left Vienna in June 1938. The train took him to Paris, where he was received by Marie Bonaparte, the Greek princess who had been his patient and who had partly organized and financed his departure, and then to London, where he arrived on a June morning, 82 years old, terminally ill, with his library intact and a fame that London recognized immediately. The letters and gifts that arrived at Maresfield Gardens in the weeks that followed were, by the account of Freud's assistants, overwhelming in their scale. Freud personally responded to as many as he could. The consulting room was reconstructed with a fidelity to the original layout of Burgess 19 that visitors described as unsettling, the same antiquities in the same positions, the same rugs, the same couch with the same blanket. The library reorganized with the same logic, as though Vienna could be reconstructed in Hampstead. He continued working. The last book, Moses and Monotheism, he had begun in Vienna and finished in London. It was a text about the origins of Jewish monotheism, about the figure of Moses as an Egyptian rather than a Hebrew, about the psychological roots of monotheistic religion. It was also, between the lines that attentive readers could identify, a reflection on Jewish identity and on what it meant to be Jewish in a Europe that had decided Jews were the problem that needed to be solved. In September 1939, 3 weeks after the start of the Second World War, Freud asked his physician Max Scher to honor a promise made years earlier. The promise was that when the suffering became unbearable and work became impossible, Scher would administer enough morphine to bring it to an end. Scher administered 3 injections over the course of 2 days. Freud died in the early hours of September 23, 1939. He was 83 years old. He had lived long enough to see the Nazis invade Poland, but not long enough to see Auschwitz. He had described, with a precision that continues to unsettle, the psychological mechanisms that made Auschwitz possible. And he had died asking that the suffering stop. The man who had spent his life studying human suffering, reduced in the end to the same simple and irreducible request that any human being makes when the limit is reached: make it stop. Epilogue. What happened to psychoanalysis after 1939 is a story of extraordinary expansion followed by painful contraction. In the United States, the European analysts who had fled Nazism transplanted the theory into a cultural soil that absorbed it with an enthusiasm Europe had never shown. Throughout the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, psychoanalysis was the dominant therapy in American psychiatry. Then came the attacks. Karl Popper argued that psychoanalysis was not falsifiable and therefore not science. Controlled clinical trials showed limited efficacy compared to shorter therapies. Neuroscience identified real unconscious processes, but with an architecture quite different from the one Freud had described. Psychoanalysis survived as a minority clinical practice, and a majority cultural influence. The terms Freud coined: repression, denial, transference. The Oedipus complex entered every European language and permanently shaped the way the 20th century thought about itself. What Freud truly was beyond the legend and the caricature. He was not the rigorous scientist that the first generation of followers described. He was not the charlatan that the harshest critics claim. He was a man who did something that very few managed to do. He looked directly at human suffering without looking away, recognized patterns that others hadn't seen, and built a language to describe those patterns that permanently changed the way human beings think about themselves. The language he built may be wrong in many of its details, but the central question he posed remains. What are we doing to avoid seeing what we don't want to see? The answer he proposed, that we don't see because we don't want to, and that we don't want to because what's there is too disturbing to bear without protection, is an answer that modern neuroscience confirms in terms Freud would not have recognized, but that point in the same direction. The volcano he described on the train to Paris, the violence that civilization covers but never eliminates, erupted 6 years after his death, on a scale that confirmed the darkest pessimism he ever expressed. Freud did not live to see Auschwitz, but he had described, with a precision that still shocks today, the psychological mechanisms that made it possible. The question he left behind has no easy answer, but it is the only question worth asking. If one idea from Freud stuck with you after this story, any idea at all, ask yourself the question he would ask if he were your therapist. Why did this particular idea stay with you, and not another? That's not a rhetorical question. That is the method. Often, the resistance we feel toward certain ideas reveals more about us than the easy acceptance of others. Freud would say that the place where the discomfort is greatest is exactly the most interesting place to look. Leave a comment with the aspect of Freud that surprised you most, or the idea that provoked the most resistance. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now and turn on the notification bell to follow the next stories. Because behind many of the figures that history has turned into symbols, there is always a human being far more complex than the legend. The next video is coming soon. The story continues.